Hi everybody, this is Cynthia Kane. Welcome back to our second video tutorial for week 2 of our class for UL100ZB, and this will cover chapter 4 of Gather. Now you'll recall in the plan chapter that we were talking about how we plan our search accordingly, including choosing appropriate resources, choosing keywords for a search statement, being flexible if our first search statement doesn't work with our keywords, and using techniques such as truncation and controlled vocabulary to narrow and focus our search a little bit more. So with Gather, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on some different formats of information, still using a range of tools and strategies to retrieve and access information, but we are again going to focus a little bit more on some different formats in a way that maybe you have not had a chance to think about a little bit more specifically. So I'm going to switch back over here. Again, we strongly encourage you to read our chapters of the Information Literacy User's Guide, our free textbooks as you go along. So chapter 4, Gather, in our textbook, will explain what I go through in this video tutorial in quite a bit more detail. So always refer back to our chapter. I'm going to scroll down here because one thing we're going to be focusing on will be something called primary and secondary sources, as well as tertiary sources of information. We're going to be asking you in some other activities to start identifying primary, secondary, and tertiary sources of information for a topic that you will be researching for the rest of this class period. So that concept might or might not be that familiar to you. So a primary source is basically a count from a person or persons who have firsthand knowledge of the event. So if you've ever read a diary that somebody wrote, that could be considered to be a primary source of information. If you're reading a letter, maybe it's a letter that somebody wrote a long time ago about an historical event such as the Second World War, and they were really going through and experiencing that, that would be a primary source of information. There are some different ways, again, that you can think about examples or types of primary sources. If someone writes an autobiography, so if I'm writing like a memoir about myself, that autobiography or that memoir that I wrote about myself and what I've gone through would be a primary source of information. However, primary resource can also be, that can be an actual research that is done by somebody. So again, if any of you are in the sciences or social sciences, you might read an article, or you might be required to find an article in which someone is writing about an experiment that they actually performed, and then they're talking about what they did, perhaps an experiment, and then having a control group, and then the results of that experiment. That whole journal article would be considered to be a primary source of information because they're still writing about something that they themselves have actually done. Oddly enough, social media postings can also be primary sources of information. So if I'm posting that I'm at Emporia State University, I just wrote that, so that's a primary source of information. So that's kind of a fun way to think about what a primary source is. A secondary source can be thought of as one step removed from a primary source, or a secondhand source. So a biography, if I'm reading a biography that was written by somebody else about a famous individual, that biography is actually a secondary source of information. That person did not write about themselves. A biography is a secondary source. An autobiography is a primary source of information. Big distinction between the two. If I am reading a critical analysis of a play or a short story or a novel, and somebody is kind of analyzing what's going on in that, very common in the humanities, that particular commentary or critical analysis about that text would be the secondary source of information, so more of a commentary. If I am reading a journal article that might be kind of a literature review, and a lot of you may be required to read these types of articles. So if I'm reading a journal article that talks about others who have done experiments and they're kind of bringing everything together in one article, That type of journal article, again, is more of a critical analysis or a commentary, and that's also going to be a secondary source of information. A secondary source is not necessarily better than a primary source, and vice versa. It depends upon the type of source that you need when you're doing research on a topic. And finally, there's one that's not exactly covered that much in our textbook, but I think it's very important to remember the distinction, and that is a tertiary source. So a tertiary source will actually lead me to primary and secondary sources. Go back to week 1. Remember when I was doing that concept map online with Bubble Us, and I was saying that I could find journal articles in a psychological database. I could find medical journal articles in a medical database. I could find references to books in a library catalog. All of those sources that I just mentioned are tertiary sources of information. So I can use Google Scholar to find articles. I could use a source, which you're going to be doing as part of your research plan, called Credo Reference, to find encyclopedia articles about a specific topic. I could use the Discovery Search catalog to find books in print or electronic form. I could use databases like I did with our previous video tutorial, Set All Complete, to find medical journal articles. So the tertiary sources are the ones that you use, such as databases, that will lead you to references to primary and secondary sources. So again, a big distinction there. So information formats, depending upon what you are searching for, you might have to use different types of information formats for looking for your information need. Social media postings are a form of information. Reliable or not, they are indeed information formats. Newspaper articles can still be essential sources of information for relatively current information, although news just travels so fast now that we often get our information in different ways. Our library does have a subscription to the New York Times online, so you could actually subscribe to the New York Times as an ESU student. You could do that with a free account and you wouldn't have to pay for it. I use the Emporia Gazette here too because that's a really good example of a local newspaper. With online newspaper sites, you're not usually getting the complete newspaper. You might get certain articles from that day's issue of the newspaper, but you're not actually going to get everything. So with the Emporia Gazette, I have to actually subscribe to the print Emporia Gazette, and then I get a username and a password. And when I put in that username and password, I can access the PDF of that particular issue online. So something to think about later on in our class is information haves and information have-nots. So if you can't afford a subscription to something, are you missing out on key information? And how is that going to affect you in the future? We've already mentioned primary sources, scholarly journal articles. Scholarly journals, again, can be published by associations or by publishers that are actually focusing more upon a scholarly journal audience, a little bit more specialized than a newspaper or a magazine. And finally, books. So all of these are different types of information formats. Is one better than the other? Again, it all depends on what you need. If you need current information, if you need background information, part of gathering is knowing what to gather in terms of the information formats that will suit your information need. I'm going to use an example now of Anne Frank, who may be familiar to many of you. She was the girl who hid with her family and family friends in an attic in Amsterdam during the Second World War until they were discovered in 1944 and they were sent to concentration camps. Anne Frank's father was the only survivor of that group, and he later found her diary that she had written while they were in hiding, and of course it became famous all over the world as the Diary of Anne Frank. So is that considered to be a primary source? Well, this one gets kind of interesting. There is a book called The Diary of Anne Frank, the critical edition, and we do have that in William Allen White's library. What happened was that Anne Frank actually began revising her diary at the beginning of 1944 when she heard a clandestine radio broadcast that was indicating that the Dutch government would be very interested in publishing memoirs and diaries and letters from people who had gone through the Second World War once everything was over. And she was very interested in that. So she began revising her diary that she began originally in 1942. So what we have now is we have her original manuscript from 1942 to 1944 when they were discovered. Then we have a partial rewritten version of her diary that she indeed did rewrite, basically bringing it up to date, making it more readable for an actual reader. And that revision is from 1942 to the beginning of 1943. She was in the middle of rewriting that and revising it when they were discovered. So what's the real diary? What is it? Well, the critical edition is very interesting because it compares all these different versions. That particular critical edition is indeed a primary source of information because it's coming directly from the manuscripts that Anne Frank herself wrote. Now, there was a play then that was produced in the 1950s called The Diary of Anne Frank. That play could be a primary source in and of itself if I'm just analyzing the play. However, if I'm looking at it as an adaptation of the Diary of Anne Frank, that adaptation consideration would be a secondary source. See, this gets kind of fuzzy after a while. In just a second, we're going to look at the secret annex online because that's a good example of an exhibit that is an online primary resource. So a secondary resource would be biographies or critical journal articles about the diary or about Anne Frank. And finally, if I wanted to find the primary sources or the secondary sources, I would go to a tertiary source of information that's called literature criticism online. We're going to look at that as well. So I am now going to share the secret annex online with you. And this is an online interactive exhibit. So this actually, as you can see, moves along with us. And it's in the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. And if I click here on Explore this room, see what it's letting me do? So is this a primary source of information? Yes, it actually is. Because even though it's online, I'm in the primary source, which is the actual house where they hid. And you see that I can explore from one room to the next. I can drag my cursor and really get into some interesting things. And if I click on About This Room, then that will let me pop up a little bit more information about this. We'll go back to Explore This Room. And again, I just wanted to show that to you as a very quick example of an online source of information that could still be a primary source, because again, that primary source is the secret annex, the house of Anne Frank. I may never have a chance to go there, but I can explore that through this online virtual exhibit, which is indeed a primary source. So you are now ready to watch the next video tutorial that will be an introduction to our engagement activities and learning assessment 2 for this week, the research plan.